Always been excited by the idea of automating the process of software delivery, and it eventually became my full-time job. The thing that we're going to show you today is a tool that I created in response to a pain point that I felt in migrating many releases from dev through to production.
And my name's Elizabeth Ayer. I am a product manager at Redgate, and I've been here for 7 years, and my passion is shipping software. It's what I get up in the morning to do. It's what I like to help my customers to do. It's what I'm all about. And now that you know a little bit about us, I'd like to find out who's in the room here today. And so I want to find out a little bit about the deployment processes that are in play in your businesses. So who here is currently using a pure script-based, update script-based approach to making their database changes? All right, okay. And who's using some kind of hybrid between that and a kind of design of database, sort of, something like that, some kind of hybrid approach? Right. And who here is using something like SQL Source Control or SSDT in making their database changes? Okay, all right. So quite a bit of different things going on. And one last check. Are all of you involved in actually designing database changes? Who here actually designs the changes in the first place? Okay, and who here is responsible for making changes in production once they've either been made by you or somebody else? Who here touches those production servers? Okay, right. So we've got a lot of people who handle that whole part of the deployment process. Fantastic. So the thing we want to talk about today is we want to talk about a distinction between migrations and manual change script process. What we mean, extra meaning we put on it when we talk about migrations. We want to talk about some key myths there are attached to change script-based processes. And we also want to show some of the benefits, some new benefits that have come with some really good tooling around change script processes. Not just ReadyRoll, but there's a whole class of tools in this area now which we want to bring to your attention because you may not have known about them already. So first of all, I want to disambiguate, right? What is a migration? When I talk about a migration, I mean a change script to a database, but one which is made specifically to take a database to a new version. So one which gets you up to a particular functional level. This is not just any random change that goes into a database, but one which is going through and probably corresponds to a particular version of the application, if there's a separate application, or it corresponds, as I say, to a particular functional level of the database. And so a migration necessarily is a thing that goes in a sequence in a managed process. What we want to distinguish it from is the poor cousin, the wild ASBO-laden change script out there that's going, not necessarily in any particular order. It's just getting made either, sort of outside a process or outside of a defined sequence. And this is what we so often see people doing when they're using change script-based approaches, is that there isn't actually much control on this process, that there's very often no defined way for the changes to get shared in organizations, and some manual steps at the end which mean that the management is slightly ad hoc at the end. And I want to share with you, this is a generalization of what I see as a product manager when I go out there and talk to people who are doing database change management, making database changes. And we've got an application team. And like I say, this is anonymized, the generalization of things we see out there. We've got application developer, database developer, a development manager, and a DBA, all working together to try to make these changes. And a sequence of conversation might look something like this. Elaine wants to get a change made. So she actually contacts the database developer, Jim, and says, I need these changes made, some details in the ticket, could you do this for me? Jim goes ahead and does it, probably on a shared environment, and then puts some scripts somewhere. Maybe attaches them to the ticket, very often emails them around, and the email becomes the change management of these systems. So Elaine says, great, I'll take care of it, got the release scripts in the release, no problem here. But then nobody hears anything else about it until somebody says, whoa, something's really broken, nothing's working, what happened? And it turns out, when Elaine looks into it, that one of the scripts didn't get picked up. Maybe somebody didn't know there were two, or didn't necessarily know in order to run them. All kinds of things get missing, go missing from the actual desired process to run these scripts. So she actually says, okay, here's the script, sends it off to Bob. This is the collaboration, all via email. Bob says, whoa, first time I've seen that script, I don't think I like the look of that. You know, okay for your QA systems, but that's not going into my production system. But of course, it's QA that's on fire right now. They're trying to get this through tests. So Jim goes back and says, no, Bob offered, do you need to understand how to make these changes better? And Bob, no, can you just run it, please? Okay, you need to get this, or Jim, can I get this change made? Bob, yeah, fine, okay, right, it's done in QA, but it's not going to be run in production like that. And finally, Chris, the development manager, looks at this whole thing unfolding before him. And in fact, fundamentally, this team didn't do a bad job of working together to solve these problems, but he still looks at this and goes, this isn't good, this isn't right? What can we actually do to sort this process out? So as a good agile team lead, he actually starts to do, some 5 whys on this. Why? Okay, so what the problem was, we had a database that we couldn't actually add our users to. That's, the QA problem was an urgent problem we needed to fix. It should never have been that way. Why? Well, the upgrade script didn't get run. Why? We messed up the manual steps. Somewhere in there, we missed out on a change that we were supposed to make. Why? We're not using our standard tools. That's what an application team who's actually working through and has things automated for the application, the equivalent thing doesn't happen on the application side because things are managed neatly through those environments and deployed in an automated way. So why aren't they using their standard tools? Well, we can only theorize that they just don't know that there's an alternative. And so that's what we want to talk about today, that there is an alternative which keeps their basic process in place of designing the changes up front and then still sending them in an organized way down all the way into production. So what's with comeback? The talk title was controversial within Redgate about, a comeback of script-based deployment processes. Well, we saw many of you in this room are using script-based deployment processes. So they clearly have never gone away. But in the Microsoft world, we have these wonderful tools that help us actually, sort of dissociate the design of the system from how it actually gets deployed. And SQL Source Control has been an excellent tool for that. Don't worry about how it's going to get deployed. SQL Compare is going to do it for you. It's all going to be great. It's terrific for cases where you have a separate design phase from a DBA who then will make decisions about how it's going to be deployed and where that's the process that gets decided later. But what we're seeing and what we saw out at customers is that there were 2 particular cases where the developers needed to get involved in understanding how those changes were made. And one of the big ones was where the changes, most of them had data actions in them, where most of the changes actually had some data component, and it wasn't enough to know what the schema changes were going to be. You needed to also say what's going to happen to those data in the tables. So very often on mature systems, every change you need to actually say something about that data. And where that's the case, the developer needs to know up front, or needs to say something up front about the intent, about what is meant to go in the tables after you've actually made your changes. So that's one big case. And the other big case we were seeing was cases where DBAs are getting slammed and are trying to push more of that decision-making into the development teams to say, okay, you guys need to actually design these changes yourself, and we can still okay them, but you guys actually have to get on top of how these changes are getting made because we're just taking on too much. We can't put all that expertise in. We need to actually train you up or do what's necessary so that you guys can do that at your end as well. And so particularly in these cases, we're seeing script-based processes come back, and particularly managed ones. So we're not talking about the wild, carefree scripts. We're talking about the ones which are following a good, well-defined, clear process and participating in the system. So why aren't people why aren't people necessarily jumping on this? Why wouldn't, Bob and Elaine's team, why aren't they jumping on this? Well, we think that they are actually held back by a bunch of these myths about migrations, which came because of the change script processes being ad hoc and pretty badly managed in businesses. And so in standard change script processes, we see a lot of error-prone releases. We see scripts getting missed out. We see changes being made very late and therefore not actually being made tested. The upgrade scripts themselves aren't being tested through the test environments. So those releases become error-prone. And I think that the script-based processes are getting tarred a bit by that. And the other one is the collaboration is really hard. So how do we share these files? How do we get them done in the same order? How can I take this whole set of changes and expect my developers to know what to run where and what's supposed to be in which state and actually manage that? And then once they have done all that, how can they know what the contents of those files are? How can we flag up conflicts early? Because I don't actually want my developers stepping on each other's toes. And again, script-based methods often get tarred with weaknesses in this area. But what we want to show you is, we don't just want to tell you, we want to show you how the new generation of migrations-based tools actually makes these things obsolete, makes these things completely untrue, and actually helps with both of these things. So this is where we pass over to ReadyRoll. As I say, there's a whole class of these tools, but ReadyRoll is one of the most fully featured out there, so it's obviously the one that Redgate wanted to get involved with and wanted to partner with. And we'd like to show you more of that today.
Right, thanks, Elizabeth. So ReadyRoll is a Visual Studio project system that uses a migrations-first approach to development and deployment. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying that it's a tool that keeps track of all your change scripts and which ones have been deployed to each of your database environments. So we're going to have a bit of a look at that. There is a bit more to it, as we hope to show you today. So we're going to have a look at how you can use ReadyRoll to collaborate in a team using change scripts, using the migrations-first approach. So let's just set the scene. So we have Bob and Jim, and Bob's a DBA, as we were talking about before. He's decided to take this on as a challenge. He wants to fix it once and for all, so he's decided to spearhead an effort to get his database into source control and start doing automated deployments. And Jim's a developer. So Bob prefers to work in SQL Management Studio primarily, but he knows that most of the team that's working in his division are actually Visual Studio users. So he wants to source control the database in an environment that makes sense to them. What you can't see here is that for some reason the Visual Studio window has disappeared. But what we're going to do, because, I just need a piece of paper actually, because I just need a mouse.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything in there?
This too?
Maybe. I might have to go to the track point. Thanks. Yeah. So we've got two Visual Studio environments. We've got one that is using the light theme and one that is using the dark theme, just to distinguish between Bob and Jim's workspaces. So let's start with Bob. So Bob has restored 3 copies of his database onto his local SQL development server. And we're going to connect to this particular database. So what we do is we start off by creating a new project. And initially what that's going to do is it's going to create an empty copy of this database on a local DB instance. But we don't want to use that. We want to use our existing database. So we're going to click Configure and connect to our local instance. So now that we've connected it, we need to create a baseline for this database. So currently our project contains no scripts at all. So we need to import a script. So hit Import, and that's going to read the system catalog. This is using SQL Compare under the hood here, and it will generate a script for all of the objects in that database. So if we just highlight this tool here, we can see all of the objects have been scripted out, including schema and all of the programmability stuff. So now that I've imported this script and it's added it to the project, as you can see over here, what I want to do is to make sure that this is going to accurately recreate my database if I need to. So I do that by clicking the refresh button here. And what this is doing in the background is it's actually creating a wholly new copy of my database, which we call the shadow. If I go over to SQL Management Studio, I can see that it's created alongside my existing database. Now, it won't have any data in it at the moment, but as I add some more objects, so we've currently only done the schema, we can also choose to include data. So I just started typing into that window, but I can also just scroll through the list. And if I right-click here, I'll start tracking the data. So the first thing it's going to say to me is, well, in order to see this data, we're going to need to refresh. And this is going to run SQL Compare and also SQL Data Compare underneath here. and it's found 4 rows in this table, which we're going to import. So same thing again, a new migration has been generated in the project. We have a baseline operation for this set of data. So it's conditionally creating it, conditionally inserting it into this table, only if it doesn't currently contain any data. And the idea of this is that it prevents an attempt for the data to be overwritten. So same thing again, we want to test that this script will work, that it hasn't missed anything, that it's not going to try and insert any data into some not null columns. So we refresh that. The fact that it's carried through and it's given me the all clear here, that's indicated to me that that has succeeded. Now, because I don't want to keep tracking this table, I only wanted to do this as a one-time operation. And the reason for that is because this is just to seed our databases. This particular table is actually changed in production, so we don't want to keep tracking it in case we overwrite any changes from production. Okay, so now that we have our baseline, we have both schema and data in our project. It's always a good practice to commit that to source control, so we have a clean baseline. So we're going to use the built-in integration with Git in Visual Studio. I'm going to push it to the repository. Now we're going to go over to Jim's machine, go to his Team Explorer, and open the solution. Now, when we open the solution, the first thing, again, it's going to do is it's going to create this empty database for us. But we want to use our own scripts to deploy this database. So what's happened is, as I've opened this, it's actually detected the fact that this project has not yet been deployed against my local DB instance. So I can view the error list in here to see which scripts are pending deployment. And if I double click, I can view the script. And I can either go ahead and deploy this to my local DB instance by either clicking the deploy project button or hitting the start button. Simplest way is just to hit the start button, and you don't need to actually open each script in order to do that. So we hit start. It should be familiar to anyone who's used SQL Server Data Tools. It does a build first, and in this part, it's actually verifying the integrity of those scripts, that they're syntactically correct, and it's also showing me the order that they will deploy. So this way, I have a bit of assurance about how this deployment is going to work before I deploy, if I want to. So I can do a build first, check the order that it's going to deploy in, and then go ahead and actually do the deployment. But you saw as I was running that, the tables started appearing on the left-hand side. So let's have a quick look at that table that we started tracking the data on, and we can see there that it has been populated. Okay, so let's now try a change now that we have our baseline. And go back to Bob. So Bob's decided to add a new column to this schema, and he prefers to work in SQL Management Studio, so that's where we're going to go. I'm going to go over here, and we're going to add a column to this email configuration table called created date. And we're going to give it a default value of today's date. So I can make online changes to this database after I've deployed it within the IDE. So I can jump between the two IDEs if I prefer that connected experience. And when I'm ready to source control this, that's when I come back to ReadyRoll and click import. And this is going to do a comparison between the state of my working database in Management Studio. And it's also going to create a database that is a representation of my migration scripts. Now, I haven't quite done what I expected there. There you go, I've modified the shadow database. That was an oopsie. Now, the thing to know about this shadow database is that it's a completely disposable database. So if you make a mistake like I just did then, you can just delete it and go back to the database that I should have edited and make that change. Oop. When all spells, start again. All right, back in business. So we'll add the column again. Okay, back over to ReadyRoll. Now I'm going to get rid of that script because it certainly did not do what I wanted it to do. It's going to recreate that shadow database, and hopefully this time we should just see this as a nice clean column addition operation. There we go. Okay, so this has created a new column, and it's going to default the existing rows to the current date and time, but actually what we want is to default the create date column to the date of the last modified date column. So let's paste in our own script to do that. So the script that gets generated by ReadyRoll is merely just a suggestion. It's because the scripts that you put into a ReadyRoll project are checked into source control. It's really up to you to decide how you want to migrate your schema. But the thing to do, if you're going to import a change, it's always a good idea to make sure that you end up at the same state that the original script would have taken you to. And we can verify that by clicking the refresh button in the ReadyRoll tool. Again, it's going to execute this script against my shadow database, and it's indicated to me that the schema is equal. And we can confirm that by double-clicking on it, and you can see there in the compare view that we ended up at the same point that this script would have taken us to. So the only difference was that we're populating the column itself using the contents of an existing column. So now that we have our new change, we want to share this with the rest of the team. So let's go over to Team Explorer. Push that into the repository and go back over to Jim's machine and pull that in. Again, it's going to show me that there's one script that needs to be deployed. And just a little bit of background on what's actually going on here. In my target database, there's a little table that keeps track of each of the scripts that have been executed on that particular server. So in this case, only 2 scripts have been executed. And just to make that a little clearer, let's order that. Okay, so we've only got 2 scripts mentioned in this table, script 1 and script 2. Now when I run the project, we'll see that the migration is deployed to my local DB instance. And if I refresh this view, you should see the 3rd script appear. So that's really all that's going on here. It's just finding out what is pending deployment by looking at this table, looking at what we've got in the migrations list, and using a process of elimination determines what needs to be deployed. So that all works really well in a situation where you are making incremental changes to an existing database. And it works really well on tables because you don't deploy in a table absolutely. You make changes to individual columns or other table level metadata. But with programmability objects, you drop and recreate or alter the object in one hit. It's an absolute type of operation. So that means that it's not a great fit for this type of deployment because of the fact that in agile teams, you inevitably have a situation in which you have more than one person working on the object at the same time. So ReadyRoll's answer to that is that you can actually change the way that it scripts out these types of objects. So typically, stored procedures will generate alongside all of your other objects. So tables and stored procedures will generate together. However, we can change that behavior by going into the project settings. If we scroll down to programmable objects, by default, it's importing into our migration scripts, but we can actually change that to import into separate script files. So this is going to, if you're familiar with the structure of how either SQL source control or SSDT stores its files, this will look really familiar. So when I click import all objects, and this is a one-time operation that we do just to set up the directory structure within our project, it's going to create a very familiar layout to those people who have worked with SSDT before. So we'll see all of the objects listed as individual files in the Solution Explorer. The main difference with this approach, though, is that we're not going to use a compare and sync to deploy changes to these objects. These files are actually individual scripts that have what we call idempotent. And what that means is that they're rerunnable. So with every change to one of these scripts, it will run through this process where it drops the object and then it recreates it from scratch. But before we make any changes to those objects, let's get that into source control. And go back to Bob's machine and pull those changes in. So let's experiment with this by making a change to see how ReadyRoll will handle changes that are made in parallel. So let's edit a stored procedure. So Bob's going to make a change to this default. And we'll just annotate it there just to make it easier to see when we go over to the other machine. Now, I'm going to go over to Jim's machine, but I'm not actually going to pull in that change to simulate us working on the change at the same time. So he's just going to change that date there. Now he's going to try and check this in, assuming that no one has done any other work while he's been working on that proc. Now he gets an error at this point because he needs to pull in the changes from Bob before he can continue. So what that's going to do when I click pull is it's going to merge the two sets of changes together into Jim's workspace. So it's successfully merged the two, and you'll notice that Bob's change appears now at the top, and Jim's now has been preserved in this prop. So after that merge took place, that has prompted ReadyRoll to update and say, hey, you made a change to this file, this needs to run again. And this will occur every time that you make a change to this file. So we'll go through that process of dropping and recreating that object, and after it's done so, it'll give me this green tick to indicate that there's nothing that it needs to do. But any simple kind of change to this object will cause that deployment process to happen again. So now that I'm happy with that change, that I've tested it, I'll push these up to the server, and when Bob pulls this down, he'll also get that change, and he can deploy it. Yes?
When you pushed that, it was 2 commits, not 1 commit.
Yes.
Why is that?
So what's actually going on under the hood is that Visual Studio is taking care of the merge step, which requires an additional commit. So there was my commit to add my own change, or Jim's change, in there. And when I tried to push, it needed to resolve that. And when it resolved it, which it did automatically, that created another commit. And that's possibly a bit more visual if I actually go into...
Handle the merge conflict as well. If those changes conflict, would that push you into the resolve?
Yes, it would have. So there's a dialog that pops up, and I deliberately avoided changing it on the same line to stop that screen from coming up. But it will give you a screen where you can manually reconcile the 2 sets of changes. It'll put one change on one side, one change in the other, and you can control the result. But I can see that branch in there and the additional commit that was needed in order to reconcile the 2 sets of changes. The other thing that I can do with that change is, now that I'm tracking these objects using these files, these programmable object files, I can use the functionality within Visual Studio itself to show me who's been making changes to these objects. So I can go line by line within here, and I can see the date and time and the person who was responsible for making those changes. So we can see Bob's changes up here and Jim's changes down here.
So where is that metadata stored?
That's coming directly from Git, actually. So there's a strong integration between Visual Studio and the Git repository. Okay.
TFS Git repository?
This is just plain old Git in this case.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Where are we up to? So that covers the collaboration side of working in ReadyRoll. You can use either method if you prefer to deploy your procs alongside your table objects. You can do that. If I know that in some situations people use that method still when they have quite complex interdependencies between objects. Say, for example, you've got tables that depend on functions, that this approach isn't as useful. So you can decide how you want to do it, and you can control it at the object level as well. So the next thing that we're going to look at is how you can use ReadyRoll to deploy to your lifecycle environments. So while we've been going through the process of collaborating, there's been builds kicking off with each check-in in source control. So I can see each of Bob and Jim's changes here have actually triggered a build in TeamCity. And I've set up this particular project in TeamCity just like any other Visual Studio project. So all the support that you need to do the builds is already there with TeamCity or Bamboo or TFS, whatever you like. So the build process with ReadyRoll is a little bit different to an application in that you aren't building a binary as such. What you're actually building is a big SQL file, basically. And this SQL file contains a concatenated list of all of the migrations in your project, along with all the logic that is needed to determine whether each script needs to be executed. So in this particular case, this is a Octopus package. Again, you can use any tool that supports PowerShell to facilitate that automation of your database deployment. So this is automatically kicking off, so I don't need to necessarily be jumping in and having a look at what TeamCity is doing. It's generally only when you do something wrong, like if I checked in a script that had a syntax error, I would immediately get that feedback from TeamCity by way of an email. So that's what ReadyRoll is doing as part of the build process. It's merely doing some script validation checks using the Microsoft T-SQL libraries and stitching all those migrations together so that it can then be passed over to Octopus. So this is the dashboard in Octopus for this particular project. And it's been creating releases as I go as well. So TeamCity has been chucking those packages over the wall. In this case, what I need to actually do before I continue is I need to set up this database for the first database deployment. And this is a little bit different to the way that SSDT works in that we're not just taking a model that's stored in source control and synchronizing it to a target. We need to say where the line in the sand is between where our current production is at versus what we have in our project. So within our project, we've got 3 migrations, but it's only one of them that is actually a change. The other 2 represent our current production state. So we need to separate those into 2 discrete folders. And just for sake of brevity, here's one I prepared earlier. So basically what we need to do is to enable versioning within our project. So we can say which is our version 1 and which is our subsequent versions. And our version 1 is the thing that defines our current production state as it is today. So we separate the scripts between a baseline folder and an additional folder that contains our new change. We could also continue adding more of these folders as we develop more features. A lot of ReadyRoll customers like to create a semver folder with each new branch in source control. It's really down to the individual, whatever works for you. But one thing that's useful about the way that these folders work is that the numbering restarts each time that a folder is created. And that assists with ensuring that you don't have collisions between the different files. So because we have this numeric prefix on each of the migrations, it's possible to have like more than one 2 script or more than one 3 script. So that's just one way that you can avoid having alterations occur to the ordering of your scripts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to a project that's already been primed with the baseline, and I'm going to deploy it to our test database. So our test database here contains our emailer configuration table, currently without the created date column. And if I deploy that, we should see that it will set the baseline first in the database. It won't execute those first 2 scripts against it. It'll just say that they have been deployed so that they don't get picked up in future. And it will execute that 1 script that we've added. It will also run all of those programmable objects too, because this is the first time it will go through and drop and recreate all of those objects. You can also control that so that it will include the stored procedures in the baseline in the case that you don't want to go through recreating all your objects in case you have thousands of them. So This is indicating that those first two scripts were not run, and only the third script was executed. Let's now have a look at the results. And we can see that new created date column has been created with the same data as the last modified date column. And that's pretty much it for the deployment demo. So what this results in is less error-prone deployments. Because we're managing our scripts in an organized way, we're giving each of them individual numbers. They're all getting checked into source control, and we're using all those tools that developers currently are using to source control their non-database assets. All of that comes down atomically each time that they pull from source control. And we're testing as we're creating new changes. So every time that I generate a new script using ReadyRoll, I'm putting it through a quick little rehearsal of that deployment because I'm running it against a physical database located on my machine. And as I showed you then, we're running through an actual deployment in test first before proceeding to production. And Octopus actually has some great functionality around ensuring that things go through a certain process, that all changes go through a test environment at the least before they can be progressed onto production. I've also showed that individual objects can be edited within the Visual Studio IDE for those who prefer just working in that environment. Or for those who still like to work in a connected sort of way, there's a workflow that's supported for that as well. And if we went through the example of merging two sets of changes.
Yeah, I mean, I've been eager to jump back in because I still want to highlight, and I can't highlight enough how important that validation step is, because there are some open source tools which do parts of this. And, from the most brain dead one, which will just run a SQL, some SQL scripts in numeric order, to some slightly more intelligent ones that help manage migration logs. But the fact that you're actually doing these validations and that this change has been so well rehearsed in exactly this format before it starts to go downstream, that's the part that's really exciting about ReadyRoll, that you get some extra checks on those scripts that you didn't get before. So through, as we say, through this build once, deploy many times approach, so that you're using a repeatable process, you actually get that predictability and that reliability about those deployments that you wouldn't necessarily get if you just had scripts being run ad hoc. You're probably wondering, all right, who uses this today? What is who is this for? Who is actually doing it? And right now, today, it's mostly application teams who have already automated the application and are feeling blocked in the database. So that the application fits nicely into a change pipeline, but the database doesn't. And so they're bringing that into some infrastructure they already have in place. And so the people who have been most excited so far about ReadyRoll have been people who actually are interested in going all the way with that deployment automation story. But I guess the particular thing that I want to highlight up there is that it's also teams where they have pretty good database skills up here, and all of the thinking work gets done in this team that's working on that version control, and the thinking work doesn't get done later on. Its validations happen in downstream environments, but the stuff that actually takes expertise is baked in early. And so these are teams, I wouldn't, not necessarily teams have gone all the way down the DevOps route, but it's certainly teams with pretty good database skills who are competent to be writing and editing SQL scripts in the first place. So those are things, it's for that kind of team that we think ReadyRoll sits really, really nicely. And so, we just leave you with some further steps that you can take. You can obviously download a free trial of this on readyroll.com. It is run and supported by Redgate. Dan works with us. It has a Redgate team, so this is not being, it's not a kind of a separate group. This is Redgate. Those tools you can check out ReadyRoll right now. There's a hands-on lab set of steps you can go through and actually try this out. Dan and I will be kicking around there also to try to help with any if you get stuck or want to ask more questions. I don't know how we're doing for time, if we've actually got time.
Yeah, we've got time.
We've got time for questions?
Yep,
hey.
absolutely.
Okay, well, we'll remind you who we are so that if you want to address questions to one of us, Elizabeth and Dan, and we're open for anything you guys would like to know. Sorry, right up there.
So the deployments
So the tool actually can source control permissions. So when I did that initial import, it wasn't on that particular object that I was editing before, but it will actually script out all the permissions that are attached to each one of those objects. So they always get recreated after a deployment has taken place.
Was that the same question? Yeah.
So it looks very much like SSDT in a way, but I presume that you don't have any, I presume you lose all the kind of SQL refactoring and stuff that you get in SSDT. I presume that's not present.
That's right.
So
yeah.
we should repeat the question. I've just realised because it's actually being recorded. So
Okay. So the question is whether or not the refactor tools that are built into SSDT also with ReadyRoll. Unfortunately, they don't because that follows the offline flow, which ReadyRoll doesn't support. But I mean, basically anything that you can script, you can put into a ReadyRoll project. It's just a bit extra effort.
Okay. By any chance, does it work with Oracle?
Unfortunately
is the question.
not. Sorry to say. We're getting asked that more and more these days, though.
If you don't have access to production, maybe if it's a customer's system, can you send scripts out the package for them to deploy themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if they're comfortable enough with running a bit of PowerShell, you can send them the two files, which are a deploy PS1 file and the package file, and that will execute the scripts that are pending deployment against their target database. So they don't need to know which ones are pending, which ones aren't.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
I'm just trying to picture how this would look in terms of the branches, feature repositories, where you don't necessarily know the order of what will go to production first, and you have to do the merge, I guess, later on.
So
Can you follow along?
yeah, so I'm wondering, is it because you've got like multiple branches in the one project?
So there may be multiple projects going on at any one time. You
Right.
don't know which project is going to go to production first. Whichever one goes first,
Right.
the later ones may have to merge and there may be conflicts.
Right. Okay. So I think the way that I would approach that is using semantic versioning. I would try and make a best guess at how these projects were going to release to production and then correct it further down the line. So you can always change those folder names or script names as needed. So at the point of merge, that might be a good opportunity to go in and make changes to that directory structure to make sure that the order that it's ultimately going to get to deploy to in production is reflected in source control.
Because the directory structure also affects the order of deployment
Yes.
as well as the folder names. Yeah.
Yeah. The folder structure actually informs the ordering of the deployment. So it's folder structure first, and then the files within the folders.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Does this fit in with Redgate's other DLM methods, or is it independent now?
It's pretty independent at this stage. However, we would like to look at some integrations with the DLM dashboard. I think there's a really compelling story there, particularly given with migrations you are writing scripts. It doesn't know anything about the target state, so having that insight into drift, I think, would be definitely a compelling use case for ReadyRoll.
What would be the benefit of ReadyRoll as opposed to sort of SQL source control and the TTS integrations and that?
So the question is the benefits of ReadyRoll versus SQL source control and the things that it provides. And that, I guess, goes back to the question of how teams prefer working. You know, there are some teams who are making lots of data changes, and if you're in SQL source control, you have to work, it's not bad for occasional data changes, so occasional migrations that sit with your designed database. But if what you're doing is very data heavy, then you're going to be every time needing to duck out of your design environment and then write some SQL and then come back in, and that's actually not necessarily capturing your flow there. So that's one thing which this would bring over that. I mean, another one is just if you have developers who really prefer working in Visual Studio, then this is going to keep them in their natural environment for those source controlling tools that they like using. So there is a lot about just how teams will like to work, and there's some people who want scripts going all the way through. There's some people who seem to have like a moral objection to a design-based approach, or vice versa as well, a moral objection to the scripts-based approach. And we're not going to come along and tell either side that they're wrong. I think we've been convinced that both are valid ways to work. And so if you have a belief that one side is better for reliable deployments for your system, then that's the one that we're going to recommend to you.
Yes.
Can you switch between those two kind of script generation things halfway through the development cycle, for instance? So when you have to drop and create objects, that works up until you bring in something where you then have to go back to a defined scripting process because of the objects you're creating.
Yes, certainly. So the question is, can you switch between importing everything as individual objects, individual objects, script files for the programmable objects? And you can do that. So if you were to delete all those programmable objects, it would just start importing into migration scripts again. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So you've already deployed it using the drop and create things. It's out in production. You're on version 1.5. Then for version 1.6, you've got something where you can't do drop and creates.
Right.
Because of dependency issues or whatever it is, and you have to generate your own scripts that explicitly specify the kind of first one you showed.
Yes, yes.
And then you switch between and...
You can. In fact, you don't actually need to drop all of those files. You can just script it into a migration yourself for like a one-time operation.
Yeah.
You can do that. Yes?
Would you see unit testing as something that externally happens at a different level, or do you think this process can be integrated with unit testing to a degree?
We have some customers that do use T-SQL-T. So the question was, what level does this sit with unit testing? We'd see sort of unit testing as sitting somewhat outside of this. ReadyRoll has testing around whether your script is achieving the state that you are looking to achieve. However, it's not running in a sort of typical unit test sort of way. So yeah, people have used T-SQL-T quite comfortably alongside ReadyRoll.
Another thing, Dave Farley, the guy who wrote the continuous delivery book, it gets very excited about the possibilities of unit testing your migrations as well, and speaks very strongly in favor of this kind of methodology where, yes, the expectation then is not just for each. So there are two different levels you'd be unit testing. One is you're testing your stored procedure logic, and that's kind of the traditional T-SQL-T kind of tests. And then there are upgrade tests where you can actually test each individual upgrade is making the changes you want. And again, yes, so that's a separate set of tests, but you can actually check at the unit, the unit level of migration that each one is having the desired effect on your data. Is that it?
Okay.
How did we get away without having to answer the question about what happens as this goes on over time and you get billions and billions of these things? I think we should answer that anyway.
Okay.
Because I think somebody's going to have had that in their minds about, but you're going to get millions, what do I do?
So, there's two schools of thought on the subject. One is that you just hide it. So,
well, like folders, just collapse
folders.
them. Right.
So, some of the more organized teams will create the folders, and what that allows you to do is to just collapse a folder and the list of migrations just disappears. So it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Whereas another approach is to actually re-baseline a set of scripts. So you can go through the process where you deploy a database in full to a test server, and then you remove the scripts from the project and you re-import that. So it can take like 50 scripts and turn it down to one. But I would only do that once you're sure that you've deployed all of those scripts to all of your environments, particularly production.
All right. And if that didn't trigger any more questions, we'll just say thank you very much for joining us. And if you have any further questions, come talk to us after.